Okay, so welcome back to the Cracks in Postmodernity. We have a very special guest today, Chloe Valdary, who is the founder of the Theory of Enchantment, which is an alternative DEI program, also the host of the Heart Speaks podcast, which I was on like 2 months ago, more or less. So Chloe, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me, Stephen.
So right now we're in Fulton Park, which is in Bed Stuy, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're doing this out in the open air, late July heat. Very pleasant though.
Yeah.
So Chloe, I'm gonna first ask you to tell us a little bit about what is the Theory of Enchantment? How did you come up with this idea?
So the Theory of Enchantment is a DEI company that I founded in December of 2018. We mostly sell to other businesses. We put employees primarily through our training, through our online curriculum. They can also go through virtual workshops or in-person workshops. There are 3 foundational principles of the Theory of Enchantment. The first is treat people like human beings, not political abstractions. Criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down or destroy. And try to root everything you do in love and compassion. So that's like the summary of what Theory of Enchantment is. And then how did I come up with it? It's been a meandering, long-ass journey to Theory of Enchantment. I first came up with it as a solution to what I felt was like a super dogmatic approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. My major was international studies with a concentration in conflict and diplomacy, so that was my topic of focus. I did Israel advocacy for like 7 years, learned a lot, failed a lot. Again, I was also super dogmatic in my approach in the beginning, and there's something very unappealing about that. So Theory of Enchantment was at first an attempt to soften the edges of my own dogmas, you might say, and come up with a better way to service the Israeli and Palestinian communities amidst the conflict. And then it became this whole framework to like learn how to love, essentially. And it turns out that that applies to many different areas, whether it's international conflicts or, you know, how do you create a culture of belonging in the workplace so that you can attract and retain a diverse pool of talent, or go into diverse markets, right? Or, you know, enter into diverse conversations between employees in such a way that's not like stifling or where people break down, but that actually might produce innovation when you're talking about developing products and services.
So what strikes me as really distinct about Theory of Enchantment as a form of DEI is that love is at the center more so than power. Because the mainstream, the dogmatic kind of DEI we hear about is about, you know, like trying to assess or empower relations and then kind of overturn them. Which, I mean, we can see how that has some value in itself, but at the end of the day, power is not going to make us happy. I mean, it's ultimately love. So, like, how did you come to that conclusion that, like, it would be most useful to create this kind of program centered around learning to love other people?
Well, like I said, Theory of Enchantment started as me trying to develop an antidote to more dogmatic approaches to understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or to solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And most of the approaches were, I would say, actually, I don't know if I've ever used the word power-oriented to describe it, but it's power-oriented in the sense that it's like, how do I win this argument? How do I prove that I am in the right and you are in the wrong? Which is actually, I think, the quote-unquote justice-oriented framework that many people reach for when they're talking about pursuing justice. But, in fact, justice requires something more than just centering power. And I don't think that people really necessarily think about that when they're thinking about pursuing justice. So I don't know if it was like an explicit question in my mind, how do I get people to shift from a power mindset to a love mindset? I just was like, well, how do you get people to love in general? Because there's going to be conflict, but I think love helps conflict be more easily held and works through. Because conflict is a part of life. You're not going to get rid of conflict, but you can help shore people up, and you can help people be compassionate towards themselves and towards each other, even in the midst of conflict. So that was more of the question, and then the natural answer for me was love.
Yeah, and this when you say enchantment,
Yeah.
it's interesting because when I first heard it, it made me think of the philosopher Charles Taylor, who I've told you about.
Yeah.
And his whole thing is that, after the Enlightenment, the dawn of secularization, we've lost this collective sense of meaning, this sense that life is enchanted with beauty, with some greater purpose. And I think we can see that in these power-oriented forms of DEI that only focus on this like mechanical sense of justice. Because again, you can achieve certain political outcomes, certain political goals, but if it's not oriented to some greater meaning like love, like unity amongst people, then where does our happiness come from? And it's what you're saying now is making me think of in one of Martin Luther King's sermons. He mentioned Nietzsche, who, one of the first people we bonded over when you spoke at the New York Encounter. He was saying how Nietzsche was kind of repelled by Christianity because he saw it as this promoting love without power, without addressing real concrete issues, conflicts, as you're saying. So he's just saying, okay, all we need to do is focus on power. And King was saying, okay, yeah, I mean, as a Christian, he really believed that love is imperative, love is at the center. But if it's this sentimental, mushy love that doesn't address real issues, then it's useless. Uh-oh. It's Brooklyn, don't worry. No, but love without power, love that isn't concrete and dealing with real issues is kind of useless. So it's interesting how you're trying to bring the whole picture together through your program.
The synthesis of love and power. And Carl Jung, who's one of the big thinkers that influences a lot of what we've built at Theory of Enchantment, talked about how I'm going to get the quote wrong, but basically, without power, or if you only are focusing on love, if you're only focusing on power, power is the shadow side of love.
Interesting.
And you can and this is sort of my interpretation of that. There's nothing wrong with pursuing power as long as it's in service of something greater. And I think that greater thing must be love.
Yeah.
But power for its own sake will always corrupt because you'll never have enough of it. You'll always be trying to seek it out to fulfill some void that you are feeling right now in your life. And I think you can see this you can see this in a lot of the economic systems that our current modernity is operating according to. You can see it in the way that we relate to each other with DEI, where there just becomes this endless pursuit of power for its own sake, and then it just sort of becomes addictive.
But using power for the sake of love and not just for your own self, easier said than done.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I'm curious in your experience, how do you try to live that out? How do you try to check your own drive for power and really channel it towards something self-giving rather than self-seeking?
So there's a lot of stuff in the Theory of Enchantment so for all Theory of Enchantment is practice-oriented or habit-oriented. So we give people a ecology of practices to take on with the hypothesis that if they practice these practices over time, they will be in greater relationship with themselves, they'll be in greater relationship with others. And one of the things that we're constantly dealing with when it comes to this question of fighting against racism is the superiority complex. Superiority complex is it can happen across any structure. So it doesn't have to be race-based. It can be, when I saw someone or when I heard someone being really assertive towards me, my ego became inflated and I immediately thought that I was better than that person. I felt that sense of inflation within my physical body. And it's the first step to getting a hold on that is noticing it. There's a lot of again, somatic physicality that is part of learning how to love. And so noticing the tingling nervous sensation in my stomach that I felt when I had this interaction with someone when they did X, getting curious about that feeling, getting curious about what that feeling codes for me. And in this case, in this example, it codes this moment where I thought that I was better than them. And then more practically, if I respond in a way that's condescending, and if you think of the word condescend with dissension, right, to look down upon someone, that indicates that I felt that I was better than that person. It's okay, so then first of all, noticing is super, super important, because then I can ask, okay, what's the story behind this experience? Why is it that when this person was assertive, I felt this ego inflation, or I felt this superiority. Well, for me, in this case, the reason why I felt a sense of superiority, which is a marker of separation, like I'm not in the present moment when I'm with this person at that moment. The reason is because there's actually something deep within me that wants to be assertive, wants to be able to be assertive, that I haven't taken responsibility for. And so when I saw that in another person, I actually felt threatened by it. And so if I can get into the habit of learning myself, noticing how these things rise and fall within me, getting curious about them, asking what the story is, asking what the narrative is, so that the next time someone's assertive towards me, and it doesn't have to be that the sense of ego inflation disappears, right? But I have choice and how I choose to respond in that moment. And if I really do theory of enchantment, deep work, I might realize that like it has something to do with my relationship with my parents and my upbringing, how I related to them being assertive, blah, blah, blah. So that when I'm in that moment where someone's being assertive towards me, if I'm taken back to the past, I'm actually not in the present moment. And I'm superimposing subconsciously my experience that I had with my parents or my caretakers or my siblings. It's bringing me back to that moment, and that's the place I'm responding to. So if I can actually train myself and practice so that I won't respond from that position, but will respond from the present moment.
Yeah, I mean, two things that stand out from what you're saying is first, the physicality of our responses. Because I feel like we're only taught to think about these situations of conflict, of confrontation, of prejudice in a very theoretical way, using our minds. But, our bodies really hold so much of the tension, our bodies play a huge role in how we receive and react to different issues. The other thing, I mean, the Jungian piece, so much of what we're hearing today when we're talking about diversity and social justice issues really kind of looks past like the depth psychology that's implicated. Like we're not really taught to think about how does my personal history, whether it's with my parents, trauma from the past, like how does that shape the way I deal with things today? We're only really taught to look at it in this very like sociological perspective, so this adds a real layer of nuance and like in depth
for sure
to what's going on. But I want to play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure.
Because a lot of what you're saying about theory of enchantment, it seems like it's focused on interpersonal conflicts, like perhaps in the workplace, in a school, dealing with issues. What would you say to someone who thinks, this is all nice, but there are larger systemic issues, larger social issues that need to be addressed? What do you say to someone with those kinds of concerns or objections?
I would ask them, I wouldn't say I disagree that there are larger systemic concerns. I just think we overlook the fractal nature of systems. So if I want to solve things on an institutional level, meaning in the institution that I am operating within on a regular basis, and I don't have practices that are determining how I show up within that space, I'm not going to change the institutional level. And I think, ironically, we see the breakdown of certain policies that only try to solve things on an institutional level. So, like, if you look at Brown versus the Board of Education, ironically, Derek Bell, the grandfather of critical race theory, who fought for Brown versus the Board of Education, who was a lawyer in the South, in the Jim Crow South, helping black folks fight against this. He writes about this in a book called Silent Covenants. He later came out against Brown versus the Board of Education because Brown versus the Board of Education implemented this top-down, sweeping institutional systemic change, which led to, mass busing of black students to white schools and other types of similar policies. And, he really interrogates the question of how that impacted local black schools in the South that were existing prior to Brown versus the Board of Education, which, yes, should have been given access to greater financial resources, but Brown versus the Board of Education actually ended up shutting down a lot of those schools, and a lot of those schools were the center of small black communities, and actually allowed for integration of Black communities on a local level, and which led to the enrichment of that community. And so we have to be careful when we talk about systems change to understand the fractal nature of systems change. And I also think this is related to direct democracy. I think because we live in a society that traffics so consistently in the language of representative democracy, we forget that in order to sustain representative democracy, there needs to be things happening on a local level, which requires a more direct approach. And the system will shut down and start to break down, as I think we're seeing, if that direct approach isn't counterbalancing the more top-down structure. So I think it's a frame shift that needs to occur for a lot of people in thinking about these issues. Another thing I'll say is we learn this in the world of business. When you have a product, Steve Jobs talked about this actually. When you have a product, just because you have an idea doesn't mean you have a final product.
Yeah.
You have to put the idea out there. You have to put the product out there in front of customers. Customers have to use your product. Customers have to then tell you what's wrong with your product. And then you iterate on that product development and you incorporate the feedback that you got from your customers into the development of new, better products. We approach DEI in this way.
Wow.
I don't know of any other DEI organization that approaches it in this way, but you can see the connection between things like direct democracy, local community involvement, local community integration, and product development of this sort. And I think without all of these elements, it's actually silly to talk about institutional change.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, and ultimately, like, a system, an institution can't know you and your needs as a person or the particular needs of a community. It becomes this substitute. And that echoes back to, this understanding of the enchantment of the person, recognizing how each person is unique, has their own story. Because without that, like, you can't truly love.
Yeah.
You can't love abstractly.
Yeah.
The other thing that I find so interesting about theory of enchantment, and it's the fact that you're trying to develop this whole sense of the person, is recognizing that, like, identity, when we talk about race, when we talk about ethnicity or culture, like, it's not this abstraction. Like, it's something with very deep roots. It's, whatever our ethnic or racial background, it comes with a legacy. It comes with a community, and that's one of the big things. We talked about when I was on your podcast, especially for people of European heritage, that when we came to this country, we were told that we could gain status if we lost our ethnic identity and just said we were white.
Right.
Especially for Italians, because for a while we weren't considered white.
Yeah, I learned a lot about that from you. And I've told a lot of people, by the way, the Christopher Columbus story that you told me, which I didn't know. So thank you for sharing that.
Columbus is not about Columbus.
Yeah.
No, but for me, like, I've told you how much it's been valuable for me to recover my own roots, because the more you have a sense of where you come from, the traditions, the heritage you're part of, like, it makes life more enchanting. It makes life more full. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about, when you were at the New York Encounter, you mentioned this elementary school you went to growing up, that really fostered a sense of rootedness in you. So if you could talk a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, so I attended Langston Hughes Elementary School from kindergarten till 3rd grade. And, it definitely took its namesake very seriously. I remember the first things in 1st grade that I had to do were memorize a bunch of poetry about the Harlem Renaissance poets and authors, or by them. I remember having to memorize a lot of propositional facts about inventions created by African Americans. There's like a poetry reciting club that apparently I was a part of. I didn't know that. My mom told me that recently. And I was imbued with this sense of resilience within the African American experience of having gone through slavery and gone through on the other side. The first long poem I had to memorize was by Dr. Maya Angelou, Still I Rise. Yeah. I recited part of it at Encounter. And as a foundational core memory at such an impressionable young age that really shaped my sense of identity. I also, my parents took me to museums that explored the history of lynching in this country. So there's also exposure to a lot of the sorrow that has been part of the African American story. And I think both of those things, it's interesting actually, I was thinking about this the other day. The very act of singing your sorrow is something that exists in many cultures. Yeah. I did ayahuasca last year in December, and when you do ayahuasca, part of the experience, according to some shamanic traditions, is music. Like, you have to, they play music when you take it, and the music is critical because the music actually moves the medicine. Yeah. And when there's another experience that I had recently, I wish I could remember, where I put two and two together, and I was like, oh wait, this is a thing. Like, African Americans have this, cultures in Peru have this, like, this is a thing. Oh, I know what it was. I did a Kundalini practice with my friend where you're in these 3 postures that are really hard, 15 minutes each posture, you're not stopping, and the central question comes up, which is, how do you deal with pain? And it was very, very hard, and I noticed that when I started singing and physically moving my upper body and like deep breathing, both deep breathing and singing actually helped move the pain.
Wow.
And that's when I put two and two together. I was like, oh wait, this is a thing. And I think it's full circle, because enchantment, like the etymology of the word, is really related to singing. It's like you're chanting, canto. Right? In canto, you're chanting, wow. And this actually,
I never thought of that.
Yeah, this actually like puts you into an ecstatic state. Historically speaking, many indigenous cultures would, and still do, chant themselves into ecstatic states, which prepares them to do some difficult thing that they need to do. So a bit of a tangent, but actually related, is like, I was exposed to this concept of like orally reciting poetry as a way to move through pain as a young child. And I didn't have that description of it back then, but now, like, retrospectively, I'm like able to see that that's what it was. And that really gels a community, holds a community together, is a sense-making mechanism, imbues you with meaning, and imbues you with a sense of power to actually move through suffering. So
and this is what fascinated me when I first heard you talking about the school, because I'm seeing how much of the contemporary DEI discourse, rooted in this very post-structuralist philosophical view, is very individualistic. And the fact that it's being used especially to push forth, the cause for racial equality, especially for Black Americans, always seemed a little counterintuitive to me, because so much of progress in Black communities was the fact that it was always so communally centered. There's always something enchanted, whether it's through the arts, whether it's through religion. And the fact that right now it's very much focused on, again, Blackness as this abstraction, as mere identity, rather than rooted in something much greater. I see how that's further atomizing a lot of people within Black communities, disintegrating the communal, the family dimension. So I don't know, like, it's ironic to me that we would think that such an individualistic worldview could actually bring people further. Whereas what you're saying, like, learning your roots, learning, the beauty, the art, the poetry, to sing your sorrow, is super empowering and uplifting. Why do you think we've lost sight of that, or why do you think that's not part of the mainstream discourse today?
I think that the post-structural framing that you describe is probably an over-response to authoritarianism. Okay. I think that this is what the Enlightenment was as well. I think that it was a response to, certain structures that certainly did emphasize communal ways of living to a certain extent, but which abused their authority and abused their power and said, we are the only holders of truth, capital T truth. Yeah. Thinking historically of the Catholic Church, for example. And so the swing to hyper-individualism was a response to that. Yeah. And we're seeing, the excesses of that. But I think it's important to keep it in context, because it historically was in response to something also really terrible. And so it's also important to keep in mind that, like, any framework can go awry, right? Like, any you can have experiences that are too communal, right? You can have experiences that are too individualistic. And so that's why balance is not, a definition that falls from the sky. It's something that you must constantly seek out, both as a individual, as a part of a larger community, in a larger framework. On all those levels, all peoples must be seeking balance. And we don't know how to do that, so.
Yeah. I want to ask you, are you a James Baldwin fan at all?
Yes, I am. We teach Baldwin in Theory of Enchantment.
Of course. So Baldwin, I don't think I mentioned this on your podcast.
Okay.
But there's an essay called Nothing Personal that he wrote.
I don't know this one.
Okay. So, it's pretty short, but he says something really fascinating, relevant to what we're saying now about how the slave traders, the slave owners, in order to dehumanize the slaves, had to first dehumanize themselves.
This is a Jungian idea too.
Yeah. There's a lot of overlap here. But he was saying how these slave traders really tried to uproot themselves from whatever their culture was, their heritage.
Yeah.
And this hollowness, this lack of roots.
Numbing.
That's what enabled them to dehumanize the slaves, but also made them hate themselves. And the more they hated themselves, then the more they hated black people.
Yeah.
So, and again, go back to this post-structuralist conundrum. Is this really teaching, assuming, yes, certain tropes about white people holding privilege, having power, is enforcing this sense of whiteness really going to make race relations better, or is it going to exacerbate them? I feel like the question should be how can all people tap into their roots so that they can first love themselves, and then it's easier to appreciate the culture of the other person rather than cutting away everybody's roots,
Yeah, I think that it's hard to know that you're swimming in water if you're swimming in water. If all you've known all your life is swimming in water, I don't think most people expose themselves to frame shifts. And so, if you're ensconced in this intellectual, academic worldview that is seemingly beneficial, meaning the worldview that, reinforces certain concepts of whiteness and simultaneously fights against it, which is also weird and contradicting. I just think that if you're in that space and you're rewarded for being in that space in some way, then there's no reason to question it. It is interesting. We're seeing a huge firing of DEI positions across many different companies. So we'll see if that results in a kind of awakening or if it just doesn't. But I think it's always worth asking if you are confronted with something that seems odd or that isn't working. What is this in response to? What wound is this seemingly addressing? And then address the wound.
Yeah.
And it can be hard to do that because it's hard for me to do that sometimes. But I'm learning more and more how to more quickly shift to that question.
Yeah, it's a process and it takes time. As you've said.
Yeah.
And this is something I know that you're also a fan of Camille Paglia.
Yeah.
No, it's funny because Paglia talks about this in the 80s when she was in academia. That's where you first start seeing this push for diversity. And she was really repelled by it because she was saying, she's an Italian woman and comes from immigrant family and has a very strong sense of being Italian and not fitting in with this Anglo-WASP kind of sensibility. She was saying how much she connected more with Black and Hispanic and Jewish students and professors rather than the WASP ones because even though their cultures may be different, there's this sense of rootedness that the mainstream didn't have.
Yeah.
So I don't know. So I think I hope that the diversity discourse starts to go in the direction of retracing our roots rather than just focusing on individual identity.
Yeah.
We'll see. We'll see what's to come.
That would be a heavy lift.
It would be, but
it's not
I have hope that
but
this could happen.
Yeah.
I have hope.
For sure. You do have the problem of people who will insist. I'm thinking of the classical stereotype of the liberal white person who hyper identifies with being a liberal white person and hyper-identifies with the guilt that comes with being a liberal white person. Guilt can imbue a person with a sense of meaning, right? And so if there's always a gap when you're shifting frames existentially, and in that gap there's often a lot of sorrow and mourning that has to take place. And the question is, are people equipped? Are people willing to do that mourning? Are people equipped to handle that mourning? I think that's a serious question that has to be considered when talking about persuading people or getting people to change their minds about something as existential as identity. There's a mourning period, you know?
It's easier to just erase your roots altogether, because then you don't have to look at the wounds, you don't have to look at the baggage.
Yeah.
You know, if I'm just like a liberal white person and I accept everyone,
Yeah.
it's easier not to have to do the work of wrestling with my own issues and accepting myself.
Yeah.
But the issue, again, like this issue of like identity as abstraction, uprooting ourselves, makes my tolerance of the other very thin, because
Right.
I don't have a foundation.
Right.
And I understand people who have reservations about fostering ethnic pride, because we
Yeah.
see how that does
The
definitely,
excesses of that.
yeah, like it definitely causes conflict. We see that. Look at the history of Brooklyn. Like you
Yeah.
see how the different ethnic communities clashed. But again, if we go for this like monolithic, like, oh, accept everyone,
Yeah.
then our acceptance of each other has no meat, it has no depth, you know. But this brings me to the next thing I want to ask you, because I know spirituality does play a key role in how you've come to look at these questions of, you know, how do we address our wounds? How do we
Yeah.
learn to love? So could you give people a little bit of a sense of how your own journey has unfolded spiritually?
Yeah, so I grew up Christian in a Protestant home that observed Jewish holidays. So you could say that my upbringing was very psychedelic. Every Christmas, we did not celebrate Christmas. We gathered together in our house and discussed Emperor Constantine and how he changed things at the Council of Nicaea. And if you don't know that reference, great, now you have homework. Just to give you a sort of insight or window into the intellectualness of my upbringing. Every Yom Kippur, we fasted.
Wow.
So my sense of time, my sense of cyclical time revolved around the way the Jews related to time, but also a protest against Catholicism. Meanwhile, I grew up in New Orleans, which is a deeply Catholic town. Around senior year in college, I had a bit of an existential breakdown where I realized that some of the things that I had adopted willy-nilly in my religious upbringing were not sufficient for me in my relationship to the divine, which unleashed a period of depression and sorrow that lasted a number of years, but also led to a lot of searching, a lot of questing, and ultimately led to me discovering the writings of Carl Jung and many female colleagues who worked with Jung, like Helen Luke and Marianne Woodman and Marie-Louise von France, who had a lot of important things to say, not only about depth psychology, but also womanhood. Specifically, I also discovered the East. Yeah. I discovered Eastern mysticism, primarily through John Vervaeke, cognitive scientist at the University of Toronto. I picked up his meditation practice in 2020, discovered Taoism, discovered Buddhism. There's a lot of contemplations, meditations on yin yang that I love, because it's all about I do, it's all about finding the balance. I've also been deeply moved and inspired by Terrence Malick, my favorite film director, who's a Heideggerian, I guess you could say. Actually explicitly a Heideggerian, and I can see some of the overlap between Heidegger and yin yang ideas. So yeah, I've been influenced by a lot in my 30 years on Earth. And that's been my path to spirituality.
Yeah, I'm curious to know a little bit more about the Jungian influences, because personally, right now, I'm getting more into depth psychology. I've seen many psychologists since I was a kid, because after my parents divorced, I was 3 years old. they thought, the best thing to do would be to send me to therapy to try to work out the issues. But everybody I saw was basically doing CBT. They're all behaviorists.
Yeah.
And never, like, when I would bring up these deeper questions, like, these existential matters, they were always very dismissive. Didn't really know what to do with them.
Oh, interesting. Can you give an example?
Yeah, like, I remember when I was starting college, I was seeing one therapist, and that was when I first kind of had my religious awakening. And I realized, like, I have this desire to be good, to be selfless, but I keep hitting this wall. Like, I keep trying to do the right thing, but I fall short.
Okay.
I feel like, and I also have questions about the meaning of things. Like, why is there evil? Why is there suffering? Like, there is this intense need to know, like, what is the point of anything?
Sure.
Especially because, I don't know, like, they put so much pressure on us to do well in school, to get a job. And it's like, okay, for what? If we're going to die.
Right.
And I came to this point, and I said this to the therapist. I was like, I need some revelation or some breakthrough from outside of me.
Yeah.
Like, something has to come to me. And he was like, that's not going to happen. Like, you just have to accept yourself. Just try your best to be good, and things will pan out fine.
Okay.
And I was like, that hasn't been working.
Yeah.
So, yeah, like, I had my religious experience. But now, like, I've been looking into Jung. I've been looking into Freud. And perhaps their worldviews may not totally overlap with mine spiritually, but the fact that it's depth psychology, it allows a lot more space for these types of questions.
For sure, yeah.
To emerge. So that's why, I don't know, like, I'm fascinated by Freud and Jung and how they allow us to really go deep within our histories, our souls, and ask, I don't know, like, how did we become the way we are,
Yeah, I mean, Jung is super into individuation, what he calls individuation, which does pull from certain religious narratives, including Christianity.
And the archetypes as well.
Yeah, Joseph Campbell plays a role there, and it's not dismissive, and it's in fact emergent from, I would say, the big grand religious paradigms, which is but interprets them in a way that I wasn't previously exposed to, but in a way that makes sense. I think part of Jordan Peterson's early people's attraction to him early on was because he was riffing on that and he was playing with that, and so it does, that form of depth psychology does tap into that deep tradition, which is still alive, very much alive within us, whether or not we're religious or secular. It doesn't really matter. Like, I just told you, I came back from this retreat, this movement-based retreat, where one of the things I learned was to fall and get back up. And it dawned on me that if the interpretation of Adam and Eve, part of the interpretation of Adam and Eve that we carry to this very day, is that falling is bad. It's a very different paradigm from learning, no, you're actually designed to fall and get back up. It's a totally different reframe, totally different shift, and I think that there are elements of Carl Jung's interpretation of the Adam and Eve story that allow space for that type of take on the narrative.
Yeah, and now since we're getting into Jung and Peterson, I did want to bring up Tate. I wanted to get your hot Tate take.
How are we going to segue into that, though?
How? Because, okay, I'm going to say for me, especially with the Jung thing, I don't know, like, I've explored the quote-unquote manosphere. No, I mean, I have a lot of reservations about Peterson, but I do feel like listening to him has helped me to explore certain questions about masculinity. There are some practical things there.
For sure, I like Peterson. I did a whole dive into Peterson in 2020. I was on Peterson's podcast. I just think he's been captured by celebrity and is now reactive. But I think Maps of Meaning was way better than 12 Rules. I mean, I didn't read 12 Rules for Life, but my sense is that Maps of Meaning is better. But yeah, like I don't have a problem with much of Peterson.
Yeah, no, I mean, the celebrity thing, it's another issue.
Yeah.
But no, but then, okay, now Tate is like the latest manifestation of this quote-unquote manosphere. You've said some interesting things about him on social media, on your podcast. I'll just say, like, on one hand, I kind of think he's a psyop. I think it's just like to grab our attention.
I never know what people mean when they say that.
I think my conspiracy theory is that he was placed there so that any type of like masculinity discourse could be like shut down.
Okay.
That's my theory. Probably not true. But no, I mean, has he said some valid things? Sure.
Yeah.
He's insane though. No, but give us a sense of like, yeah, what is your hot take? What do you make of it?
You know, I was in a meeting yesterday and I asked, I was like, especially coming from this thing where I had to wake up at 6:30. It was like boot camp. It was like I wake up at 6:30, throw my body into these very intense situations and learn how to adapt. And I came away with a realization for why people are attracted to the military. Like, I got it. I was like, okay, cool. But then I thought to myself, I asked this question yesterday to someone. I was like, what percentage of people, of young men who watch Andrew Tate, do you think actually go to the gym regularly and consistently?
Yeah.
Like, probably not that many. And I think that's very telling. Because, yes, I think Tate is like speaking to a deep wound that men are experiencing right now, which includes feelings of aimlessness, feelings of purposelessness, meaninglessness, right? Which are all deep wounds that we must solve as a society. Generally speaking, historically speaking, Esther Perel told me this. She's like, you will, historically speaking, you will see a rise of where there's been a rise of fascism in Europe. There's also been a masculinity crisis. Like those things go hand in hand. So we need to solve it for sure. But Andrew Tate himself is in my read, is a deeply wounded person who has not worked out the issues that concern his relationship with his father. You know, you have he was basically without his father from the age of 13, moved to the UK, looked up to his father as this, like, you know, chess master who taught him martial arts, but then all of a sudden his father's gone, right, for pretty formidable years. Like 13 is like around puberty, right? And so he only, from that point on, sees his father like once or twice a year. So he has an idealized version of his father in his head that he's always trying to live up to. Idealized because constantly absent, right? And I think that he hasn't dealt with those wounds. And he says really important things like go to the gym and get yourself together, and very similar to Peterson, I would say, in that sense. Like, be able to endure hardship. But then he will also suggest that men be vain and simply try to accumulate as many women as possible, as much wealth as possible. I mean, it's actually a power-oriented structure. Yeah. Ironically, he has much in common with the so-called woke left, which he derides. Both are power-oriented in their paradigm. And so, yeah, I just don't think he's that interesting, actually. Yeah. Super, I could say super influential, but again, like, what percentage of the men who watch him are actually going to the gym? I think that's a tall tale sign that he's not as he's not as practically talkless, you know, influential as just because he has like millions of followers and retweets. That's not the same as going to the gym and building your body to endure hardship, right? So,
have you seen any of his videos with Aiden Ross, the Twitch streamer?
Maybe. I don't remember how Aiden Ross looks.
He's this young kid who's, he's a Twitch streamer, just plays video games.
Oh, is he the guy where he's like, you need to go to the gym? Yes. Yeah, I've seen that.
He calls him Pudgy.
Yeah.
I think first, I think it's kind of funny just to watch these, because it's entertaining. Yeah. No, but the dynamic between these two, it's this strange father-son type of dynamic, which personally I think echoes a little bit of Socrates' dialogues with these young philosophers and athletes. But it definitely goes to what you're saying about this wound of masculinity and this need for a father. Yeah. And no, I don't really think Andrew Tate's the best father figure, but the fact that there are these young men looking to figures like him, it says something. You know, it's just something that we need to be paying attention to.
For sure, and I don't agree with, you know, these... I don't want to call them feminists, because I don't think they're actually feminist, but, like, these so-called feminist responses, which is just to, like, shit on men and be dismissive of men and dismissive of the wounds that men carry. There's just better sources. Like, James Hollis wrote a beautiful book called Under Saturn's Shadow, The Wounding and Healing of Men. that I would highly recommend for anyone who's interested in this topic. I mean, that's the only one I can think of off the top of my head. But like in general, the Jungian depth psychology world has a lot to say about this.
Yeah. So then the next thing I wanted to ask, I'm going to shift gears again. Mm-hmm. So you often talk about the role music has played in your own life, but also in your development of theory of enchantment. Mm-hmm. Why is music so important to you?
I do think I was exposed to music in the womb. My sense of dance is uncannily instinctual. And I do appreciate this new discovery that I just told you about, which is that like I come out of a tradition that has a very specific relationship to music, African American tradition, that uses music to transmute energy. So whether you're transmuting sorrow, whether you're transmuting meaningless pain into sorrow, which those are not the same things, right? Or sorrow into joy, or any other type of transmutation. I think music is a beautiful salve and a way to process life. And so as a result, we reference a lot of music in the theory of enchantment. We have people study different songs. I'm really happy that I'm able to more tightly connect. It's almost as if it was always there, but I just didn't know it. Like the enchant part with the fact that there's so much music, so much poetry in theory of enchantment.
Yeah, and I want to know, I mean, we're sitting here in Bed Stuy. Yeah. Somebody over here is playing like all these awesome like soul classics. Yeah, the older Valdary's for sure. But also we're in the home of Biggie, of Jay-Z. I mean, like this area has a rich history of producing great music. But you also DJ.
I do. I DJ. I produce music when I find the time to. I love dancing. DJing is all about moving from one song to another seamlessly, fluidly. So, I love providing music for. Actually, I'm having a jam session tonight. Believe it or not, you're welcome to join if you want to swing by. But I love music. Music is I don't know if it's my first language, but there's certain elements, I'm not trained in any way, but there's certain elements of music that I instinctively understand.
Yeah, and I mean, as you were saying, music does have this transcendent, enchanted quality that can break through so many barriers. Like there's something deeply universal. Yeah. But within theory of enchantment, give us an example of a song that you've used.
Yeah, so there's a lesson on parental baggage. There's several lessons on parental baggage, actually, in our curriculum. And one of the lessons asks students to listen to a song by John Mayer called In the Blood, which is explicitly about parental baggage. And then uses that song to prompt questions about people's relationship to their parents. What are the traditions that their parents passed down to them that they'd like to keep, that they'd like to release? How does their relationship with their parents show up for them in actual conflict in the present moment? Can they get curious about that? Ask questions about that? In the song In the Blood, John Mayer explicitly asks, how much of my mother has my mother left in me? And so, again, I think it's like a psychedelic introspective to see what you're made of. People just assume that they're born and they're like, I don't believe in blank slate theory. Like, you're operating within a paradigm that has been impressed upon for thousands of years by people who came before you. You are the inheritor of that. That's actually fodder or compost for meaning if you are given the right tools to help you get in right relationship with that. And I do think I really value the upbringing that I had for all of its topsy-turviness. The central question I was forced to wrestle with was where does everything come from? You know?
Yeah, no, and it made me super happy to hear how much you incorporate music into the curriculum, because for me as an educator, using music is super important, especially teaching theology and philosophy, which, can be hard for young people to get into. Yeah. But as soon as you present music, especially pop music, and present certain questions, like it really helps students to like enter more deeply into certain bigger concepts. And part of the reason why I do that is because like music played a huge role in my own journey, especially my spiritual journey. I don't remember if I mentioned this when I was talking on your podcast, but I mean, my parents raised me mostly with soul music. My dad was very big on Motown. My mother loved disco. And it was like, it was in like the middle of high school that I developed my personal relationship with soul music, because, I mean, obviously, okay, the history, it's rooted in the spirituals. It's rooted in the experience of the slaves, of finding hope, resilience within injustice and suffering. But also there is this like spiritual depth, this awareness that there's something greater in life. And I remember, I mean, I feel like specifically it was the singers within like the neo soul music movement, so like Badu, Lauryn Hill, D'Angelo, like there's a certain depth there that just totally captivated me.
Yeah, Badu is wild. I love Badu.
You know what's funny? When I went to get this coffee at the coffee shop down there, they had one of the lattes was named the Badu.
Oh, cool.
I don't know
Wait,
what was
did
it.
you go to Milk and Pull?
Yes, I did. Okay, so they have the Badu. If you guys want a Badu latte, go to Milk and Pull. But especially Badu. Like, I would listen to her songs on repeat because I was like, she's tapping into something in my soul. Like, I can't name, but like, she gets it. And that's what made me say, like, I want to know, like, where does this beauty come from? Like, what is this all what is this all about? You know, so like music is crucial. And the thing that concerns me though is like a lot of us, I feel like, are quick to reduce pop music just to entertainment, when really it can do so much more than just entertain, you know.
For sure. I mean, one of the things we take pop culture very seriously at Theory of Enchantment. It's not just entertainment. It's not just a form of entertainment. It's teaching us something about what it means to be human, about what we're yearning for. And even if that music is sometimes trafficking in escapism or numbing or disassociation, then the question becomes, well, what are we numbing ourselves from? What are we disassociating ourselves from? What are we trying to escape? How can we get curious? Like, the questions in Theory of Enchantment is like, how can we get curious about everything? Because what we're often, as human beings, threatened by is the fear of the unknown. So how can we untrain ourselves or retrain ourselves to get curious about the unknown, be delighted by the unknown, be enchanted by the unknown, so that we can live without this like very somatic sense of threat all the time, which is not a very fun place to live from.
I also know you're very into Afro house.
Yes, all things Afro beats, Afro house, Afro Amapiano, like whatever is coming from the continent I'm in.
So what do you hear in it though? Like what's fascinating to you?
So that is a sound, especially Afro beats. That is a sound that I think I heard from the womb. Like I don't know how to explain it. It's very familiar to me. There is an album called Sounds of Blackness that came out in like the late 90s or something that I definitely grew up listening to.
Wow.
And I like
keep your head up.
Yeah. Like it's also got a very 90s feel to it, but it's got some elements of Afro beats. And I just remember that being one of the earliest albums that I remember hearing.
Wow.
And yeah, there's definitely African rhythms in my most distant memory. Like I hear it and I feel like I don't know what I feel like. It feels very familiar.
Yeah.
Like even before I was born, it's like there's something there. There's some like lineage that I not only reaching for, but I feel like connected to. Yeah. That's like in my bones.
I'm very happy to see right now. Like there seems to be this going back to the roots of like of African music, African beats. Like whether it's in Afro beats, whether like I see the Hispanic genre of dembo is like very much pulling from the roots. And there's so much like philosophical, spiritual depth there. It's something, I mean, just really can reawaken the soul.
Yeah, know? And growing up in New Orleans, which is the birthplace of jazz, right, which has these like, New Orleans is a very heavy place, I will say. But one of the things I think about is like slaves used to dance in the square and would be punished for it or were perceived as a threat. And one of the reasons why they would be perceived as a threat for dancing, first of all, this is something I saw at this retreat I was at. Drumming has been used for many occasions, right? It's been used for dancing, but it's also been used for fighting. It's also been used for like rebellions. So like there was this sense from the master clan that like they could whip themselves up into a frenzy and just start rebelling. So that was one reason to try and make it illegal. But another reason to make it illegal is like this stark contrast of these people are and they're enslaved, but they're like dancing. Like they're free enough. There's a sense of freedom enough that they can, and that is existentially threatening to the power structure. But I come from that lineage. Like that is my ancestors, like my great-grandparents. My grandparents experienced Jim Crow in Louisiana. My great-grandparents experienced it. Grandparents before that were slaves. So like that is the heritage that I come from, of dancing in the Congo Square, even though you're enslaved.
Yeah, so the freedom of these people in the midst.
There's also, sorry to cut you off, there's also like a somatic thing of, this is related to singing, movement. Being able to move pain. And constantly moving to a beat as a salve, as a medicine to move pain. Which is another like threat, if you will, to the Cartesian framework. I
was just gonna say that
of mind-body separation.
Yeah, because last year I had a music journalist on here who talked about Brazilian funk, the new genre that's kind of exploding, and one of the things he was saying is that like this Cartesian Western worldview that says what matters most is the mind. Like music of the African diaspora totally shatters that because they had this sense that the body was enchanted, that there was spiritual truth within our bodies that comes out when we dance, when we make music, when we're drumming. And that's why, again, like I have a lot of hope seeing the kind of music that's coming out today, because I think it shatters this like post-structuralist kind of like Anglo-centric worldview that is very dull, that can be very just boring,
I would like to know, in the same way that you educated me on like what Christopher Columbus Day was a response to, I would like to know more about what this rejection of the body was in response to within the Anglo-Saxon history.
I mean, part of me thinks it has to do with climate. That like the countries that... Yeah, like... I feel like the countries that really bought into this Cartesian worldview were mostly like Northern European. I mean, it started in France, but no. But then the other thing, like I do think there is this religious component because I don't know. Like Martin Luther was very skeptical about anything physical, anything human. Wanted to totally focus all of the religious devotion to God itself, as opposed to like the more human manifestations. So
I wonder why. Like what was going on in Martin Luther's life that he like came to this conclusion?
I mean, we know that he was not happy with what the Catholic Church was doing with the indulgences and like the sacraments. But I mean, in terms of, here's Jung again. Like, I wonder if there were events in his own history with his childhood, whatever, that made him distrustful of the body. I don't know. I mean, somebody should write a thesis on that.
This is my theory about Paul, which is a side note. But like, I think my suspicion is that Paul had a weird relationship with women, which explains his more pointed scriptures against women talking in the church and all the things he said about women. It's like there's some repression that seems clear to me in those texts, and it makes me get curious about like, okay, what was happening for Paul at this time? Like, what was happening for Martin Luther such that he developed this repressive relationship with the body? Because it always comes from somewhere. Again, where do these things come from? Like, it always comes from somewhere. If I could know where it came from, I could be more compassionate towards it. Because without knowing, my default is to just be like, you're full of shit. Goodbye.
So, all right. So before we head out, anything you want to plug, anything you want to tell listeners about?
Yes, businesses, check out theoryofenchantment.com. Enroll your employees in our curriculum. buy our workshops. I do great workshops. They're super fun, I promise. If you're an individual, you can also enroll in our curriculum. You can also check out the Heart Speaks podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Valdary. You can follow me on Twitter, although I'm barely there these days, at Valdary. And spread the word. We're trying to get Theory of Enchantment more out there so people bring it into their spaces, their places, all the things. And if you have done Theory of Enchantment and been deeply impacted by it, please let me know. Slide into my DMs. I would love to hear from you and learn about your story.
Awesome. So check out Theory of Enchantment. And Chloe, thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Stephen.